Hello and welcome everyone to this new edition of the ISTAT Learning Lab. Very pleased here to have with me a topic that is very, very timely. And I'm very happy that Professor Morris Kleiner, head of the chair, AFL-CIO chair in the labeled policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Welcome, Morris. Very pleased to have you on this learning lab. As I said, to discuss this very timely issue of the manufacturing jobs and where have all the workers gone now. I think it is fair to say that some of the points that you will be making are US kind of centric, but obviously a lot of those will also affect the global workforce and will apply to other regions in the world. This is definitely a global phenomenon, and we have been seeing this in aviation very much affecting throughout the supply chain for aviation. So Morris will go through the different factors that have come to affect where we are today, including government policy and globalization and other factors, and hopefully will also to take us and a view on where we can go, where we will go from here. So Morris, thank you very much. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be with you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to this very distinguished and well-informed audience. So thank you very much for asking me to do this.
No, we're very happy to have you. Before you start, Maurice, I remind the audience that there's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, of the Zoom screen. You can put in the different questions that you have, and I'll be happy to pick them up and put them to Maurice at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, Maurice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I thought I would share some slides with you. Can you see them?
Yes.
Good. Well, the title of the talk and what I'll be focused on is where have all the manufacturing workers gone, implications for aviation. And I have to note that the views are my own and none of the organizations with where I am an affiliate. So wanted to state that up front. And thought I would take you on a journey to start out with. And imagine that you are doing some time travel, and would put you into the situation of being Back to the Future, which is, I guess, now a very prominent Broadway show and was initially a very popular movie. And in this movie and Broadway show, the main character goes both to the future and goes backwards. So I thought I would take you initially backwards, and I want you to think of yourself as going back to 1900 initially, and then we'll go to 1947, but enter the time travel going back to 1900. And since most of the workers in 1900 were in agriculture, I want you to imagine yourself as a farmer plowing a field, let's say where I'm from in Minnesota, plowing that field, and all of a sudden you come across a crystal ball. You get out from behind the horses and you pick up the crystal ball and you look at it and you say, well, what are things going to be like maybe 100 years from now? You're in 1900, maybe in the year 2000. And what would my job be like? Would I be a farmer? Would other people be farmers in the year 2000? And so you look down and all of a sudden, the answer is in 1900, about 40% of all employment in the US was in agriculture. By 2020, a little over 100 years, about 1.9% of all employment was in the sector. Well, where did all the workers go? And what were they doing? Were they unemployed? Were they sitting around watching Netflix? You wouldn't have known that in 1900, but were they sitting around on their front porch doing nothing? Since 40% of all the workers were in agriculture. Well, what happened to the consumers of these goods? Did consumers starve as a result of only 2% or less than 2% of all workers being in agriculture? And the answer is none of those. Workers went to other places, and consumers were doing, in fact, better than they were in 1900. So that's one of the answers. Let's go forward and move to 1947. And in 1947, manufacturing was king. And I see we have the King of England here. But in 1947, manufacturing was about 32% of all workers. And that had gone down in 2023 to only 8% of all US workers were in manufacturing. And yes, there was an increase in the rate of decline around 2001 when China entered the World Trade Organization, and a fair number of workers and output went to China. But it was a small, in any event, the effect is trivial compared to the long, slow, inexorable decline in the importance of manufacturing as a source of US jobs. And the decline in manufacturing, if you were picking up that same crystal ball in a manufacturing establishment, what had happened is people weren't doing without. In fact, they were doing dramatically better. In 2023, per capita income had risen from about $15,000 per worker per capita to about 66,000 in 2023. And disposable income had grown about the same rate. So our prosperity doesn't necessarily depend on large employment in manufacturing. Technology dramatically raised productivity in manufacturing, and auto workers, and in fact, aerospace here and abroad needed far fewer employees now than they did in 2000, and they make better cars that last a lot longer. And that's a powerful force in reducing employment in the auto sector. And the same is true in many other industries, including aviation. Well, where did all these workers go? Per capita income couldn't have risen so dramatically if most of the workers who left manufacturing from 1947 to now landed up working in fast food establishments. And here's an example of Donald Trump working at a fast food establishment over the last weekend. So that they didn't go just to low wage types of jobs. They ended up doing other things. And to sort of say, what did they do? This sort of goes to the background of the issue of creative destruction. Lots of jobs were destroyed, and in many industries. And the Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, created or coined the term creative destruction, and it being an essential fact about capitalism. Schumpeter, who was born in Austria and then emigrated to the US and was at Harvard University for a number of years, just before he died, they asked him what his goals were. And he said, my goals are to be the greatest economist in the world. I have a goal of being the greatest horseman in all of Austria. And my third goal is to be the greatest lover in all of Vienna. And before he passed away, he said he achieved two of the three, but never said which two. So that's the mystery of Schumpeter. Also, nearly all businesses fail, he said, victims of innovation by their competitors. The same thing was true in agriculture and manufacturing. Allowing businesses and industries to fail lead to innovation and growth, which was the case in both of these industries. And what happened? Where did these workers go? Well, they moved from manufacturing, in the second case of our time traveler, to financial services, medicine, biotech. And the thought experiment is you can imagine a steel worker in 1947 might be a personal trainer in 2023 or 2024. And they're all examples of industries that have grown dramatically over time and powered our prosperity. Occupations that were involved in service industries required government regulation. And the icing on the cake, at least for the US, was that these workers who went from manufacturing went into banking and software, where the US are huge exporters. Certainly, the US's largest manufacturing exporter is Boeing. And we'll get into that and some of the issues happening at Boeing in just a few minutes. So what happened? Where did all the workers go? And if I were to boil everything down in terms of what happened, here's what they call a heat map. And it starts in 1850, right before the US Civil War, where agriculture was king, into the 1950s, where manufacturing is king, bringing it up to 2015 and beyond. You'll notice personal services, healthcare, education, all moving from fairly well-paying manufacturing jobs to being fairly well-paid service jobs. And where unions dominated in manufacturing, other forms of labor market institutions, such as occupational licensing, dominated in the service industry. And what were these kinds of industries, or what were these kinds of jobs? So occupations that are licensed in at least one state include a wide variety of jobs. So for example, these are, at least in the US, these are all regulated by US states. So in Louisiana, florists are licensed, and they control entry and movement across state lines. Locksmiths are licensed. Now, you may think that's a pretty good job, or that's a pretty good idea to license locksmiths. For example, you wouldn't want a burglar to be a locksmith, although if they were a good burglar, they might be a darn good locksmith in terms of their competency, but they might be unscrupulous. So you may want to keep those folks out of that occupation. And you see the famous wrestler Hulk Hogan. And in many states, professional wrestlers are required to get permission from the government in order to work in this occupation. And occupational licensing grew from less than 5% in 1947 to now 1 in 4 workers, or 25% of the US workforce, requires permission from government in order to do their work. So that's been also very dramatic change in the institutions that are in the US and many other labor markets. Europe and the European Union have followed suit. And this is one of the reasons for licensing, is that professional associations serve as the equivalent of unions. So this chart shows what professional associations tend to form. They tend to organize in the before period. And whenever there's a professional association that formed in a state prior to licensing, so most of the licensing occurred from about 1920 through the early 2000s. What happened is that the professional associations organized, they lobby the state legislature, they lobby the government, and they get the occupation becomes regulated. And there are lots of benefits to becoming regulated, not the least of which is a substantial increase in income. And when these associations organize, there's a dramatic increase in the likelihood that these organizations lobby and get to become licensed, which is a right to practice. You can't work in the occupation without getting permission from government. And one of the issues is that what are the states that adopt occupational licensing? And they tend to be the bigger states. So states like California, Florida, and New York are the first movers when occupations seek to become licensed. So they're the innovators. And smaller states, because they largely follow what the bigger states do, and they can implement policies and implement or establish boards very much like the big states. So small states like Wyoming, Delaware, and Vermont are the last or the laggards in terms of licensing many of these occupations. In the US, as I mentioned, 1 in 4 workers are licensed. And at the state level, there are well over 800 occupations that are licensed in at least one state. And that's been one of the major changes that has occurred in the US workforce and in many other nations around the world. So that's been a major change as occupations moved from manufacturing to services. They also this also resulted in a change in the institutions that govern these occupations, from unions to professional associations that try to get these occupations regulated. So what else has happened in manufacturing? One is there's been a very dramatic decline. Certainly, those of you working in aviation are very much aware of the decline in occupations and the types of occupations that employ workers in aviation. And if you just go back about 25 years, in 1999, 4 of the 10 most valuable US companies were manufacturers, and that included companies like Boeing. Now, none of the top 10 firms in terms of their economic value are in manufacturing, although number 11 is Tesla. And the market value of companies like Boeing and Intel are worth half as much as they were 5 years ago. So there have been some very dramatic shifts and movement out of manufacturing to business services and technological services, high-tech businesses like Google, Intel, Facebook, and companies like Uber. So what has happened as wages go up? What has happened to workers in manufacturing? And starting in about 1980, if you look at the value added of payroll, starting in 1980 and going through the early part of this century, you'll notice that there's been a very dramatic move away from labor-intensive to capital-intensive forms of production. In large part, that was due to relatively higher wages. And as economists will often tell you, if the cost of labor goes up, in the long run, you're able to substitute capital for labor, and the effect is the early one we noted, that was the decline in manufacturing, the number of manufacturing workers, and that's reflected in the payroll over value added or compensation. There's been a very significant shift to capital intensive modes of production. And that also has reflected in where jobs are growing. Areas with relatively high cost and high regulation have seen relatively lower growth in employment by industry. So states like Illinois and other states like Oregon have seen relatively lower economic growth. States like Texas, South Carolina, and Alabama have seen much more rapid growth in employment, especially recently. And these states that have had the slower growth states tend to be ones in the Northeast. Rapidly growing ones tend to be ones with somewhat lower taxes and lower regulation. In terms of global effects, we've seen very similar effects that I've described for the United States happening in other countries. So even China, which had manufacturing value added as a percentage of gross domestic product, saw a decline. The US has seen also a very similar decline, but the trend lines have been somewhat similar in that manufacturing has become a much smaller percentage of GDP or gross domestic product in manufacturing relative to other sectors, including business services and technology-oriented companies. Also, one of the issues that I mentioned earlier was that the ratio of Chinese imports to domestic consumption has grown. So Chinese manufactured goods have had a fairly significant effect on manufacturing in the US and has decreased to some extent manufacturing growth. It's been a small but not insignificant effect on domestic consumption and manufacturing growth, with 2001 the year that China entered the global trading partners, or became a global trading partner and entered those institutions. Now, what do unions do? We've talked about institutions in other sectors, namely business services, but want to talk about unions, since they're have a much more important effect in manufacturing relative to other institutions like licensing in the service sector. And what do unions do in terms of wages, productivity, profits, economic growth, and certainly the role of voice? The most notable role for voice is that several weeks ago, the union leadership negotiated a contract with Boeing, but the workers, in a resounding 95% vote, rejected that contract. And today there's voting on whether they're going to accept the contract that was proposed to them by the union leadership and management. In terms of wages, what do unions do to wages? Not surprisingly, just to tip my hand, that unions raise wages, but not as much as they used to. Productivity, it depends on the establishment and where what's happening in the relationship between labor and management. Profits, unions tend to reduce profits. They reallocate resources from shareholders to workers. Economic growth tends to be somewhat lower, but certainly unions are a pretty good deal for workers in raising their voice and letting management know what they want out of the workplace. So not surprisingly, and perhaps for most of you, something you already knew quite a bit about, is that union membership has been on the decline. Union membership peaked a little bit after our time traveler in 1947. In the early 1950s, 1 out of 3 workers in the United States were members of a union. By the 1980s, that had declined to about 1 in 5, and now it's about 10%, with a little over 6% of union members, the percentage of workers in the private sector who are union members. So a relatively dramatic and steep decline. And really there's, in manufacturing, although unions remain relatively strong, although they've declined there as well, it is a fairly dramatic and systematic decline in union membership over time. Now, when you look at union membership in manufacturing, it has been on the decline, and this is the trend through about 2020. The blue line is overall across all industries. Utilities has remained relatively strong, with some decline there as well. And in manufacturing, unions have declined as well. So there's been an overall diminution of union influence across many different industries. Now, one of the stark changes that have occurred is the role that unions have in terms of raising wages. So the line that you see is what is the union wage effect. And you'll notice back in the 1970s, the union wage effect was about 30%. So you would expect that a union worker with very similar characteristics would make about 30% more than a non-union worker. But there's been a very dramatic decline in the wage differential, where in 2020, the union wage differential is about 10%, the lowest it's been in decades. So unions are not having nearly the significant effect on wage determination that they had in the past. Now, why has that been occurring? One of the reasons for activities that are taking place, for example, at Boeing, has been the inflation rate. And this graph shows inflation. The early 1947, inflation was very high. It was right after World War II. There was lots of pent-up demand, and inflation skyrocketed. The second highlighted area is the 1970s, where we thought we could do both guns and butter. And in fact, we got relatively high inflation rates. Those of you who are of a certain age will remember the 15, 16% mortgage rates in the 1970s and the high rates of inflation over a long period of time. And now fast forward to the 2020s, and you'll see inflation rates largely due to the pandemic and the shutdowns and the response and the recuperation from the pandemic. Inflation has taken off as well. Well, has this had any big effect on manufacturing and specifically on strikes? And what we found is that they correlate very nicely to what's happened in terms of the number of striking workers. So if you go back to 1947, you'll see a huge number of strikes occurring right after World War II. And in fact, one of the reasons for the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which imposed restrictions on unions, were the fact that there was such a large number of strikes for unions, largely to try to catch up with the inflation and the pent-up demand and pent-up wages that occurred in World War II. In the 1970s, with a very rapid rate of inflation, there was also a very dramatic increase in the number of strikes. For both periods, there were no provisions in contracts to allow for inflation to take place. So one of the things that we found was that the cost of living adjustments occurred in the 1970s. So companies like GM, General Motors, put into their labor contracts cost of living adjustments. So as inflation went up, wages also went up. These were largely bought out by companies, and what you see occurring now with the longshoremen and in aviation is that wages were kept down because they were contractually obligated during the early 2020s when inflation took off, and as a result, in current negotiations, there are real efforts to catch up in terms of contract negotiations, and as a result, there are some very visible strikes that have taken place within the last year or so. Now, specifically, what's happening, the current strike in aviation? And today is a very important day. The workers are voting on whether to accept the contract that was negotiated by labor and management regarding the strike at Boeing with the machinist, the labor management dispute involving a wide variety of different issues. Now, potential solutions to these types of strikes that largely result in unions trying to catch up with contractual obligations that resulted in their getting relatively lower wage increases. And as I mentioned, union wage increases have been very low in comparison to non-union wages and low by historical standards, are the COLA provisions and in the cost of living adjustments and contracts being tied to these cost of living adjustments. In 1976, 61% of all labor contracts had these provisions. 20 years later, it had dropped to about a third from their peak level. In 2023, the United Automobile Workers demanded cost of living adjustments as inflation started to increase, or UAW workers wanted to catch up with inflation. And there's been a significant push to raise or to re-implement cost of living adjustments in labor contracts. Certainly in many other areas of society, for example, Social Security benefits are tied to the cost of living. But firms, after the spike in inflation in the 1970s, tried to buy out these cost of living adjustments in a wide variety of industries where collective bargaining agreements were negotiated. Now, what is largely happening in the specific negotiations that are taking place with Boeing and the machinists. And currently they can make about $84,000 per year. And the proposal that was agreed upon by the union leadership and management were about a 35, on a present value basis, about 38% increase in wages. The compounding of that wage increase was about 38% increase over 4 years, with 12% in the first year, 8 in the second, and 8% in the second and third year, and 7% in the fourth year, but no cost of living adjustment. Contributions to pensions, incentive pay to try to increase productivity, with about a minimum payout of about 4% in the contract. The workers, if they vote today to accept the contract, would get a $7,000 bonus and a return to existing contract language regarding the ability of workers to take sick time and to accumulate sick time. Overtime, a limit of 2 hours on weekdays, and workers can voluntarily work up to 160 hours of overtime into a quarter. And even though the average pay is around 84,000 with overtime, many of the machinists were making well over $100,000 given the opportunity for overtime. One of the sticking points has been the defined benefit pension plan, which Boeing bought out in the 1980s. So now there are contributions to pension plans as opposed to guaranteeing pensions for workers. So the settlement, as it currently states, doesn't restore the traditional pension plan, which was a defined benefit. In other words, if you work certain numbers of years, you are guaranteed a salary into retirement. But may include, and this is what they were not clear about in the provision, but was an initial sticking point for the union, was to include Puget Sound employment guarantees, so that Boeing would not move its workforce to South Carolina, where they have a substantial number of employees. So that's been a particular issue for the union, and it was unclear, at least in the initial provisions, whether they were able to get the Puget Sound employment guarantees in the current contract. So some very important issues, pay raises, as well as fringe benefits and issues for the union that are involved in the current negotiations that the workers are voting on. Now, what's going to happen in the future? And look forward to our discussion as I conclude my part of the presentation. And in the future, there was an American baseball player who played in the American League, and the World Series is starting today, dealing with the New York Yankees and the Los Angeles Dodgers. And one of the players noted in terms of predictions, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. He was, I guess, not only a fairly good athlete, but also an interesting philosopher. And in terms of thinking about the future, what will happen in manufacturing with respect to the use of artificial intelligence? How can that improve and make manufacturing more productive? Can robots do it all? Our 1947 time traveler saw lots of labor. If you go into manufacturing firms now, you see lots of robots who are very smart. What will happen with government subsidies? Schumpeter would call them corporatism, government subsidies to different types of firms. How is that going to change over time? And what are unions going to be looking for? What are union wage and effort proposals? How much productivity and what are wages going to be in the future? Will management continue to avoid unions? Management moving manufacturing to low union environments, like the kinds of states that are growing very rapidly. And given the current political climate, what's the likely effect of tariffs? Are there going to be tariffs uh, uh, for imported goods that will try to protect U.S. industries from, at least from the U.S. perspective, of unwanted manufacturing goods that many, at least in the political environment, view that as reducing jobs and employment in this, what the U.S. views as a key sector. So all these are important issues for the future. Very hard to make predictions, but they will certainly be issues that many of you in aviation will have to make your bets on in terms of what's going to happen and how is labor and management, how are they going to grow, what's the use of capital, what's the use of labor in manufacturing. So look forward to your discussion, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues with ISTAT in the ISTAT Learning Lab and try to at least give you some insights into where have all the manufacturing workers gone. So thank you for the opportunity, and very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Morris, for this trip through time and giving us the background and the history. And yeah, some very important points that you mentioned there. As far as the future, AI is obviously on everybody's mind. But to start with more closer to home. And closer to what was to today's events. Obviously, nobody knows the outcome of the vote, which is happening right now. I mean, the last time they voted was resounding defeat for the union leaders. This time, they've improved terms across the board. So one is hopeful that it will impact. I mean, are you saying that the decline in manufacturing jobs is similar to previous waves, and is it more unlikely to have these jobs back in the number that they were before? Do you see this as one of those historic kind of major trends?
I think that it's hard to think of the trends dramatically changing. That is, we've gone from 40% of the workers in manufacturing going down to 8%. What's the right number is anyone's guess, but certainly the ability to substitute capital for labor has been the large movement in manufacturing. So again, going through a steel manufacturing plant or going through an auto plant, all you see is one person starting the machine in the morning and getting out of the way of the robots who are producing steel, who are producing cars, and those sorts of trends. And now in the future, having AI maybe take away the job of starting the machine in the morning.
Thank you. Let's pick up. We have two questions from Tyler Warner. First one is, can you comment on the fact that a foreign country which possesses a large amount of rare earth metals and high technology manufacturing processes, percentage-wise, can be sustainable for the US and Europe if geopolitical tensions continue to elevate over time?
Yeah, certainly political economy issues are very important, and countries, nations in Africa that have minerals, they're certainly going to be important as we in the manufacture of cars moving to electric vehicles, EVs. Will require rare earth minerals, and those are going to be important geopolitical and political economy issues to produce these products. I'm not saying products are going, we have better products, more products now than we certainly did by a factor of 5 relative to 1947. but it just takes a lot fewer people to produce those products, and those people haven't gone away and aren't sitting in their front porch twiddling their thumbs. They're doing many other different jobs, becoming coders, becoming genetic counselors, a job that didn't exist in 1947. So there is this process of creative destruction of certain jobs going away and other jobs being invented.
I think this question was specifically about Russia. Can we continue to exclude Russia, I guess? But but I think
Yes, I
there's
mean,
that's
certainly that's beyond my pay grade to see what different leaders are going to be doing, but certainly getting those minerals and how they're
yeah.
allocated is going to be a big issue.
His other question was, where do you see deregulation is needed the most, and where is additional regulation is needed the most? And so
In
I'll give you.
manufacturing, I
Uh,
assume in manufacturing or
yes,
economy wide.
I'm
Certainly,
assuming manufacturing. Let's just focus on manufacturing for now. Yeah.
yeah, certainly there have been issues at Boeing where uh, there have been a number of important problems that have occurred, especially at Boeing. Many have attributed that to the lack of regulation, the lack of government oversight. But in the production of at least commercial aircraft, there are huge incentives by the customer, by the company, and by the test pilot to make sure that these planes are safe. And certainly uh, different companies, if I were to go back 15, 20 years ago, Airbus was suffering from lots of production problems and the way that Airbus planes can be flown and the automation that takes place and pilots complaining that they can't override what the plane is doing. So there were lots of complaints in Airbus, and these are very rare events. Aviation is safer now than it's been in the last 50 years. Fewer crashes, fewer deaths, so that it seems to be working. But like a strike, strikes are very rare, but when they happen, they're a big deal. And when regulation doesn't work, it makes the front page of your podcast.
Indeed, indeed, it's a very high visibility industry, as we know. Pete Renham had a question that he believed that COVID pandemic changed the rate of change of people leaving aviation manual jobs generally, if not, manufacturing overall, at least in Europe. Do you have any view on this?
Yeah, well, certainly there's the most important thing of the pandemic is working from home. And certainly uh, if you're producing airplanes, you got to show up. You can't phone it in. But if
Mm.
you're an executive or you're a white collar worker, you can have lots of days where you can do it from home. And that has become a systemic issue across all of US industry. And now 2 to 3 days a week working at home has become the norm, and workers expect that. So that's going to be a feature of especially white collar work that's going to continue in the future. But if you're a machinist and you're putting in wiring in a plane, you can't do it from the comfort of your desk in your office. So there are workers, it's going to be bifurcation. People who are boots on the ground are going to have to show up, but certainly others, like white collar workers, can spend 2 to 3 days a week doing it from the comfort of their living room.
Yes, I know, and definitely. I mean, we're seeing this, and this is not manufacturing only. This is, as you say, all jobs. People now assume or expect to be able to work from home a few days a week, and therefore, I mean, this overall, it decreases the attractiveness, I guess, of manufacturing jobs overall. So, further complicating the task of uh, the manufacturers to retain talent, I think
Yeah. Yeah.
is what
And
they
in
want to say.
many areas, utilities, manufacturing, where you're putting things together, uh, the blue collar workers have to show up. But again, if you're a white collar worker, you can do that. You can have 2 to 3 days a week where you're doing that from home.
Indeed. Looking forward overall, I mean, what do you think manufacturers need to do to retain and encourage, um, you know, uh, the jobs for people to stay? Is there anything beyond pay? Is it only a compensation issue, or do you think there's other things they can do to retain employees?
Well, I think the idea of non-wage benefits, ideas of teamwork, the not or the psychic benefits from doing some of these jobs may make these jobs more attractive. Some people don't like to work from home. They like the camaraderie of
Yep.
working in teams and working with other people or doing things with other people. Being part of a team is important. You look at athletic competition, a large reason for people liking to play uh, pickleball is getting out and working or being with other people, doing things with other people. And I think that's the comparative advantage of manufacturing relative to many other jobs where if you're a coder, there are three bad things about working from home: the refrigerator, the bed, and the TV. And those are problems of sort of working from home, at least from the employer's perspective, people doing too much of each of those uh, tasks.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, unless we have any other questions, I suggest we bring this learning lab to a close. Maurice, thank you so much for your time. This has been very, very interesting. I'm sure my colleagues in ISTAT will have learned a lot. Thank you, and thank you
And
for the
thank
audience.
you for the opportunity to address this audience.
Absolutely. This on this very important topic. Absolutely. Thank you. This recording will be available on the website of ISTAT and on YouTube, I believe. And yeah, we look forward to very soon. Thank you again, Morris, and wish all a very pleasant day.
Thank you.